This is Critical Nonsense, our high-lowbrow show about culture, science, and tech. This week, special guest Meron Medhanie joins us to talk about taking our employees seriously, and Joey asks us about psychedelic stuff.
Woo!
I'm channeling my third eye, and what I'm seeing is this is what a Joey sounds like. And this is what an executive producer and part-time yoga instructor Jess Vander sounds like.
Hi, this is Jess. It's actually Zumba instructor, but proceed.
Sorry, I was looking with my third eye, and I should have been looking with my first.
Those are just misaligned.
It was the past life he saw.
You're right. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And that was our special guest, Meron Medhanie, who will be joining us this week. Meron, what do you sound like?
I sound like a born-again tennis coach. I just got back into playing tennis and helping the kids.
Helping the kids?
Helping
Who are
the kids.
Who are the kids playing tennis, and how delightful is this?
It's so awesome. It's wonderful. I got a girl who came for her first day of tennis to go from sitting with her mom outside of the gate to sitting inside the tennis court to hitting some balls.
Yes.
She did not hit with the rest of the crew, but she made a friend. And I think next week it's going to be better. So shout out to her and her courage.
Yeah, it's baby steps. I remember doing like lifeguarding for very little children. I would do swim lessons, and it was like that, like week to week or day to day, like getting them closer to the edge, put their feet in, like get in, move around, blow bubbles, like that, like slow process of getting people in, like step one in the journey to becoming herself a reincarnated tennis pro. Housekeeping, we don't have any. This place is spick and span. And with that, I think, let's just get into it. Meron, you had sent us a message, so why don't you share what your topic is this week?
Yes. So my topic, really, the title of my book of this topic is What If, no, not even what if, employees are consumers too. And that was inspired by some work that Joey spearheaded with some other wonderful folks at Sylvain in partnership with Kendrick. We dropped a new off-white paper last week. If you're not listening to it this week, last week would have been July 13th. Yes, one more time, air horns.
Yeah.
And in it, we talk about organizational purpose. We touch on brand purpose and have a nice little diagram of the difference between brand purpose and organizational purpose. And honestly, for me, someone who's worked in brand and advertising for over 10 years, brand purpose feels like it's for show. It feels like it's really to win over consumers. But organizational purpose is that deeper work. It isn't the short term, it's the long term. It's the walk that accompanies the talk, or the walk, talk, delta situation thing that someone coined. I remember reading comprehension. But it definitely reminds me of something I've been noticing for a while, and I'm sure you guys have been, you all have been noticing it, and listeners have been too, and it's employees holding their companies accountable publicly, preferably on Twitter, but in other spaces as well, in the same ways that consumers have been doing. But consumers can do it. They could be trolls and they have nothing to lose. But employees, they have their jobs, they have future job opportunities and more on the line, right? Breaks in their networks and professional relationships. So I'm curious to know what you both think. What do you think might happen? And what might change if companies freaked out about their employees' transgressions against them before it went public? Or at least held them in the same regards as consumer when they outcry in a very public forum. So I'm curious to know your thoughts. I feel like we can go to a lot of different places with this.
So I think this is real. I think, you're seeing a lot of, for lack of a better word, like internal activism within organizations, right? There was recently the CHRO, Chief Human Resources Officer at Adidas, was fired, resigned. I don't know the exact terms of the departure, but left the company as part of like a group of 300 or 400 employees like rallying together and saying that person needed to leave based on the company's like historical performance with Black folks and people of color within their staff. And there had been, there was like a moment last year on the back of George Floyd's murder where there was a young designer who was sort of like, the conditions here are not great. And, she was out doing stuff in the community, but she was like, like, this is where I am every day, and started protesting at the company. I believe
it's
she
Julia
like,
Bond at Adidas, right?
Yes. Yeah. I didn't know her name. Her name is Julia Bond, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the ultimate culmination of that was that the Chief Human Resources Officer was let go as sort of like dereliction of duty for, being responsible for those things happening under their watch. And so like that as sort of a singular example, there are many more right now, Google employees, Facebook employees, Apple employees recently were protesting that there was a person on staff who had written a book that said a lot of misogynistic things in his book about like, he was basically doing like the Tucker Max version in 2020. I'm dating myself. Like Tucker Max was like a blog of just like a very misogynistic, like finance bro type of person in like the early 2000s, who was like pretty despicable. I was, for the record, was not a reader of Tucker Max, just knew of his existence. But you're seeing it everywhere, right? Like those are the types of things inside that a average person or user, consumer of some good would not be able to understand, that there is this gap between what a company says and what a company is actually doing on a day-to-day basis.
It's so interesting because, before I moved to New York to work at Sylvain, I was in Portland. And so I had friends that worked at Adidas, and I hadn't heard about this most recent news, but I've heard about their challenges as, Black employees at Adidas. And it just felt like it's been years upon years upon years, like just building, and hopefully they see a sense of change. But I think it gets really interesting, challenging, contradictory when you have a brand that is trying to reach a specific culture. I think it's been said about Nike in the same way, like, does what's inside reflect what's on the outside? Does the treatment of the employees inside who really represent the design target, are they really at the table? Are they being treated and able to work in an environment that, respects them as much as the brand says they respect that audience? So I think we probably so many can say the same, where, the design target that exists inside of your organization, if consumers knew what was going on, and
Yeah, and I guess that's the premise of your question, Meron, right? Like this part of, okay, so what about can you start at the root of the problem, which in many instances is internal? And I guess to that, what would that look like? Like what would it be to take care of this business before it's public business?
Can you elaborate on that, Jess?
I guess part of the thing, and tell me, Meron, if I'm hearing you right, like what I'm understanding is this that a lot of companies don't recognize or appreciate the severity of an issue until they are held accountable externally. And the question is, what would it look like then to be held accountable internally? This internal activism, as you put it, Joey, like what is a way to make that work enough so that people don't feel the need to reach out and continue the conversation wherever else someone will listen?
Yeah, I think I'll let you go after me, Joey. But the one thing that I've just noticed is that people are afraid of a bad PR narrative, that their solutions are Band-Aids or sweeping things under the rug. So I think like there isn't, it doesn't seem like there is like enough investment in the root to make the change, rather than trying to like fix the problem or make the problem appear that it's fixed with minimal effort and investment. So that feels like the challenge. But Joe, if you have any thoughts on solution.
Yeah, I think there's a question that I hadn't really been considering until you brought this up, Jess, but it is like what consequences matter? Like the discussion about consequences seems like today the only currency, to your point, that is worthy of sort of elevation of an issue is like in the public square, right? Like some sort of like bad press or whatever becomes, right? Where I think companies are looking at their customers as like their key revenue stream, and you don't want to affect the revenue stream, and these stories become public, and that will impact how you're doing business, whatever, etc. I think that is a really late indicator of a pretty serious problem, right? Invariably, for a story to raise to that level, it means like, one, the problem was really bad, and two, you didn't address it for long enough that people resorted to, right? And in a lot of these instances where there is internal activism, people are putting their jobs or their careers on the line because they have deemed the problem severe enough, and at least in most of the instances that I can think of, was not being addressed quickly enough, or like with warnings and with conversations, right? Like nothing was happening. And so it becomes this sort of like nuclear option, right? Like there's like a little bit of brinksmanship in the path. Like even when you hear, Julia Bond, I'd heard last summer in like August, a podcast where she was being interviewed and someone was just telling the story of what was happening at Adidas. And she, like, if I'm remembering the story correctly, she had kind of gone through other channels up until this point of like having conversations with her manager or like elevating it, trying to address it, and nothing's happening. And I think that idea of like there's only one consequence that matters, like affecting your business, is a demonstration of I don't want to like sound arrogant, but I think it is like a fundamental misunderstanding of the value of your employees, right? Like even if you're looking at it in like purely like financial terms, like replacing an employee is extremely expensive. Like some estimates put it like replacing an employee at like 150 to like 200+% the cost of that employee's salary, right? Like, so like purely from financial terms, if someone is leaving your company or your churn is high, like that is expensive. So, but like on like a human level, like would I want to be treated this way? Like it often feels like that sort of like emotional context is getting removed when you get to like a senior enough level, or that person is just like so removed from the people that are sort of like manning the company in the day to day, that everything sort of comes back to like, am I increasing sales? And if it's not relevant or like directly tied to sales, then you sort of come back to like that can be deprioritized.
What's interesting is when I think about when a consumer calls out a company's behavior. And when an employee does, you're like the severity, like, you know, the bubbling in the building. I'm sure there's such a small percentage of employees that are going straight to Twitter when something happens. And if it is, it's like, oh man, my boss was tripping today. You know, like it's not like I'm about to put myself on the line, right? There might have been like 5, 10, 15 like attempts through different channels before it's like, okay, now I have to enlist the public, versus the public, they're just like, I'm just go to Twitter, you know, like they're not going through it. So that's an interesting, if you think about the journey, like the consumer journey versus the employee journey of like taking it to the public. A lot of times it feels like, okay, you're not listening to me. Like this feels like the final straw. And like, I have to mess with your money now for you to take this seriously. But you're not aware that you're messing with the money beforehand, like you said.
Yeah, it's like it makes me think of like the moms who have to say "I told you so" to their kids because like the kid doesn't take the mom seriously because the relationship, even if the advice is totally sound, the relationship makes them think that it's somehow less worth heeding. But I think the thing that then needs to be addressed, which you mentioned earlier, Meron, is more around like the tangibility, the incentives, and like the sensing of the incentives being misaligned. Like people don't realize that they're acting out of their corporate interests until it's very potent later. It reminds me a lot of even just in the financial industry, how, you know, something that we had found for a project even a couple years back was how something like 66% of consumers say saving for the future feels like saving for a stranger. And it's because how pressing the issue does not feel relevant until you're like, oh, wait, I need to retire and I cannot retire. And that feels like this brinksmanship, you know, it's only too late where you realize, oh no, this is exactly conflicting with what our whole system is designed to do. So then how do you make it feel more, pressing in the moment?
Yeah, there's this aspect to this that I'm wondering about, right? Like the clear threat to your point is like you're going to lose your employees in these cases, right? Like the question that we sort of started with is, you know, the like employees as this additional audience that needs to be served now. And I think taking into account some of like the context that we're sitting in, you know, earlier this year, maybe February, Jess, we had that discussion that Aaron brought up about sort of like thawing out and like the Great Resignation. And like there's a bunch of names popping around in culture, but like Monster just put out some study, which, you know, grain of salt, like it's in their best interest to say like everyone's looking for a job. And also they said 95% of people are evaluating their job currently. Which even if they're like exaggerating and it's only 75%, like if 75% of people are like evaluating whether they want to change their job, it's a fucking lot. And this idea of millennials as sort of like cushy or like needing a lot of things from their jobs, I think can like we wind up attaching sort of a meme to an idea that I think actually goes deeper in a lot of these conversations, for sure. Like, right, I think a lot of tech companies have gotten this like organizational purpose thing not quite right, in that they like make this like experience where it's like great coming to work because whatever, like fucking nap pods or something, you know, like whatever, like the joke thing about it is like free lunch and nap pods. But I think the reality is that at least in the conversations, both in, my own friends or extended friend network or anecdotally that I'm seeing online or reading articles about, like it doesn't actually feel like that's the thing when you're getting down to the individual employee that they're asking for. And I think this is where the thing that we talked about in the paper, that, the distinction between purpose clarity and purpose camaraderie. I think a lot of these companies are like, well, we have like a really nice office and, you have food and like a good vacation policy and whatever, like all fits in this sort of purpose camaraderie. Like you're building an environment where it's like, it's cool to be here. Versus like the idea of like, I know what I'm doing. I feel morally good about what it is I'm doing and what I'm participating in the world. And I think historically that was just like, that was not part of the baby boomers calculus and when they were getting a job. And like, maybe there's shade there. I'm not intending that as shade. It just like was not a factor. It was like, am I getting paid? Is it steady work? Is it reliable? Is it predictable? I can fucking leave it at the office and go home and live my life. And that's just not the calculus that's happening anymore. And I think like for the better.
What's interesting though is that COVID took all those things away, like the camaraderie. And I experienced it myself. It was like when the cool building, when all the like group activities, when the feeling of like connection, but maybe not like deeper intimacy, work appropriate, of course, with your team, and you're just left with
you're in good company. We love intimacy on this podcast.
But you're left with like the work and maybe people that you see and work with via Zoom. It's just like everything gets stripped away. And I think that's a lot of the clarity that people had. And when you were talking about like, what are people looking for? If it's not the nap rooms, though, I love a good nap, or free food, which we like as well. But, I think a lot of people that have left their companies want to make change. They want to be a part of the change. And they have been met with, I don't know, just no access in helping make that change come into fruition, whether it's leaders being like, that's not your role, or free labor and thinking up these changes, right? It's like it's something you're doing additive to your day job. And you do it because it's important. It's making the culture better for you and those that are coming after you. But you're still like... You're like begging to take on the struggle of making a change and still not able to make that impact, and it becomes very discouraging. So I think people are looking to like be a part of the change that they want to see, and help to create and build it. Obviously, people are always looking for opportunities and growth and support, but I don't know. I think more honesty and more transparency. Like if I can't be a part, if that's not my lane, let me know. Don't lead me on to think that I could actually make a difference outside of being a part of your census that's positive of like another Black woman on our roster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To that, I guess I wonder what are it sounds like, maybe having some company codes could be part of that honesty and transparency. But I'm also just wondering about the other signals that say a company is earnestly trying to focus on this purpose clarity, as you put it, Joey. Like what signals would you send then to try to explain like, yes, employee who wants to be a part of that change, we are doing it. And here's how you can know.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple things, right? Like in the off-white paper, we talked about like creating new external metrics to see if you're delivering. I think in the same way you can create internal metrics, right? Like a lot of times I think, in smaller companies, it becomes easier to have like more direct conversations with your staff and understand how the company is serving them, and are you doing a good job as an employer as well as like what you're doing for the work, right? And like it feels like fundamentally what we're talking about, like in that where we started in this conversation of like employee activism and sort of elevating things to that level, like I wind up coming back to like biological metaphors, and it feels like companies don't have the sensory system to get the input sooner, right? Like,
Yeah. How do they tell? How can you know it's happening?
Like imagine if you had
burning
no senses to be able to tell like you're in a burning room until like you were getting pain, right? Like you didn't feel it getting warmer. You couldn't see that there was a fire. You couldn't smell that there was a fire, like all of these things. And all of a sudden the room is ablaze and you're like, ow, that hurts, right? Like everything is on fire. And now you're like, oh, I got to do something. And it's like, shit, it's way late to respond because the house is ablaze.
Frog boiling.
That idea of, like how do you begin to build sensory systems into an organization to respond to it? And like in the moment, I don't know if I have like an amazing response to that, but it feels like that is what needs to happen, to where you're like not responding when like destruction has already happened.
Mm-hmm.
I do think this other thing that you brought up though, Meron, about COVID removing a lot of things. It is interesting, this like great reevaluation or great resignation, like whatever the term of the moment is. Like there are good things that have come. You know, we talked maybe 2 years ago now, Jess, about that Harvard study where when they corrected women's wages for temporal flexibility, the gender pay gap was not nearly as significant, but it didn't sort of remove the fact that women still needed to take jobs that had greater temporal flexibility because they were taking on a greater burden of like family support and childcare in particular. And like this context that we're in now where, you know, the pandemic has affected women in the workforce more dramatically than it's affected men, in part because of sort of gender separation between jobs that happen, whether, you know, not getting into like the systemic reasons why or that does or doesn't happen, but within the context of like some of these professional worker contexts that we're talking about, it is creating a dynamic where, one, people are, because of the demand shock within the workforce that is happening right now, where there's a greater demand for employees in this moment, and so companies are having to work harder. It is creating a dynamic where like it feels like a moment like as workers where it's like claim it now or it's gonna like take another dramatic scenario like this to be able to seize on something. And it's kind of exciting that people are taking that moment to say like, okay, I'm a mom, I can do this job, I just need to be able to like work from home, so I'm there to like give my kids a snack when they get home and like, you know, channel them into something else. But like everything else about this job I can do, except for the fact that like I can't be in that location 5 days a week. And those moments now where people are saying like, no, like, fuck it, I can find work somewhere else because there are more jobs than there are people in this moment. Like people seizing that moment is kind of exciting.
Do you feel like people have more agency right now to choose, or maybe it just depends on their profession?
I don't know. You know, I don't know. I think the amount of conversations that we're having on like a national scale about labor, both in professional contexts, like, you know, in quotes, professional, whatever, like white collar work, as well as blue collar work, I think is meaningful, right? Like we're having conversations about the minimum wage. We're having conversations about like employee rights, employee working conditions, like more employee flexibility that is not about like these, in quotes, like cushy millennial things, right? Like having a family and having like a natalist policy where you're like allowing people to have families and still be, like providers for their family by having a job. Those feel like it's a moment where companies are like you're creating a competitive dynamic in the market right now in which companies that rise to those conditions will have a better time getting employees to come in and stay. And so that competitive dynamic feels like a good thing. And it does feel more present than I can ever remember. Whether or not something comes out of that, that's like an entirely different conversation, I suppose.
Yeah, I think to like wrap up this, this conversation a bit, I think it's interesting what you said. Like, it's not about the surface level perks and benefits of, that people are looking for. They're looking for, let's see, how has it been said? I feel like Osei wrote it in a newsletter, like it's about dignity and not about like some of these other words that we're used to hearing all the time. And it is that dignity in terms of what are my working conditions, both like mentally, emotionally, psychologically. Can I have the life I want, a family or the way that I want to live that isn't, just the new floor, the new basics, or not even, it's where we've been. And, can I have honesty and transparency? Can I be a part of the change that you're seeking to make? When we're talking about codes for this, new internal metrics, I think something that I thought would be a really great build off of what you started in the white paper was growth plans and performance reviews, and how are you building in working towards that purpose and clarity and rewarding that as part of like your annual review cycle, and like finding more places to build that in. I think the last thing that I think is really interesting around like internal activism and thinking about the risk that employees are taking because of the severity to, raise the red flag for the public to see, in my mind, doesn't seem as risky as it might have been in the past, because there are other companies waiting to greet you with open arms based on, that experience. And those are the ones that are going to be seen as the heroes. And to your question, Jess, like that's going to be the signal to be like, okay, this is what you stand for, because this person who either choicefully walked away or was pushed out for speaking on their values is being embraced here. And maybe that's where I might want to go. So, it's not just about losing current employees, but future employees too, who are watching and seeing like, is there an alignment here? And how do you handle these situations as they occur?
Mm-hmm. I think, Jess, does that bring us to your wrap-up corner? I think it does.
It does. Meron, you brought us this question about what it would look like if a company were to take employee matters into their own hands before it goes public. And I think the concept that this is, we'll take it metaphorical again, perhaps, to this like biosphere, medical, whatever. I'll just give you a doctor example, right? Like trying to figure out how to recognize the symptoms of a problem prior to it metastasizing and becoming very severe for your business should be more evident than ever, given the demand for, a company that's got itself figured out is at an all-time high. And taking those active steps, building them incrementally into how you operate, how you listen to people for what they want, and also paying attention to like the bad stuff that's happening and being like, I wonder why this is happening, seems, we're obviously talking about it because right now it's so pressing, given how many employees are fleeing wherever they're going from, hoping for something better. And frankly, they may land somewhere where it isn't yet. But that doesn't necessarily mean that this same problem is solved. And I guess read the off-white paper.
There we go. We've done it. We've done it again.
We've done it again.
Hey, Jess.
Hey.
Tell me if you think that this is a segment idea.
Okay.
I can't even take myself seriously. Joey tells the internet why it's wrong. Is that a segment?
That's every topic you bring.
We just haven't labeled it that, but now we know.
Well, for our listeners' sake, before most episodes, Joey brings a question along the lines of like, "Are we doing this wrong?" Knowing that he's insinuating we should be doing it differently.
I mean, when your whole job is to be a strategist and you've been doing that for a long time,
It's just
maybe
natural.
the generous interpretation is you've gotten good at fixing problems. The ingenerous interpretation is you think you know more than you do, which is maybe a little bit of both. So in like the memetics of the internet, fun, joy time, Twitter being dumb, in the past, I don't know, like 4 or 5 days, July 15th. So by the time this comes out, it'll be like 2 weeks, but when we're recording, it was like 4 days ago. Someone with the handle magnificent adult baby at, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name because I'm going to butcher it.
Okay.
But posted a tweet that began, "A few days ago, I took a medium dose of acid and wrote for several hours straight and admitted some things to myself, mostly about money. Let's start here. Last August, my mom gave me $100,000 for my birthday. I resented her for this and also suppressed the resentment." This was the first tweet in like a very long thread of tweets about this guy's acid trip and having all of these discoveries and about himself, his relationship with his parents and money and so on and so forth. The internet exploded, as it's wont to do, of just like making jokes and like joking on like, oh, like the poor rich kid like got $100,000 and is sad about it, like whatever. But I got hung up on like the psychedelics component of this story and the fact that he had like an emotional breakthrough in this conversation. And so my question for y'all is, why are we still missing the point with psychedelics?
Is the point that we should all be tweeting long-form narratives of introspection when we receive our trust fund and are upset about it?
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly it. No, the point is like, this is not a good vehicle for having a conversation about psychedelics, right? But this is also like a big conversation that's happening right now that has psychedelics as part of the story. And what was interesting to me, because I've been, like backstory, like I wrote a treatment for a documentary in 2012 called Get Better, like talking about like the therapeutic aspects of the treatment, whatever. Like nothing happened from it, obviously. I don't even know how to begin making a documentary where it involves giving people acid and helping them work through some of their problems. Let's put that aside. But I've been interested in like the therapeutic aspect of it for a long time, and the science has been progressing. And in our live show, we talked about this around the sort of like long history of like shamanic or medicinal rituals in cultures all around the world that use psychedelics to like have breakthroughs. And I read this tweet and this thread and I'm like, this guy just had a massive emotional breakthrough about his money and his parents and like his life using acid as a means to do that. And there are lots of studies and Oregon is legalizing and DC is legalizing therapeutic uses of psilocybin mushrooms. And I'm like, no, it doesn't seem like anyone is talking about this. Literally the response is like, you're doing it wrong. You should be like listening to music and dancing, or like, things like, or like, I don't care about this like rich kids problems. And I'm like, but he did the thing that we've all been saying we should be having a conversation about, and everyone's like missing that part of it. And so it just made me like, not bummed out, but I'm like, oh, this could have been a moment, but it is like not the right place to have that conversation, I guess. I don't know.
Well, I guess context, right, comes to mind. It's like, what is the context in which we accept psychedelics to be used? And so the ones that are like, you should be like listening to music, dancing, partying, or like when it comes to shrooms, it's like, oh, I was in a desert. I was in some gorgeous landscape surrounded by nature. And that is what you do in those spaces. What else is there to do? It's sort of like, what's the context? And then when we think about it in a medical sense, it's like, okay, it's administered to you. So that's the context, even though, he had some sort of, like you said, an emotional breakthrough. And, that was therapeutic. But, if he had that with his, psychiatrist, like, would it have been received in a different way versus someone doing it recreationally and not acknowledging the benefits that it could have, or a different way it can be used?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my fear in some of these conversations is like, I am like very science oriented, as we all know, but it feels like one of those moments in like the failures of Western medicine, right? To sort of medicalize this thing, which does have therapeutic effects, is like the ways in which we will allow it into the system, right? Like historically, you had sort of like shaman or shaman equivalent figures in societies who would guide people through this, right? Like some sort of spiritual guidance through this experience to make sure that you were getting to the other side, that you were feeling safe, that you were feeling comfortable. Those are like key factors in the therapeutic administration of psychedelics, is that you feel comfortable, safe, and able to focus on whatever it is that you're dealing with, whether that's addiction, whether that is depression, whether that is some other issue in your life. The idea is like to focus on it, right? Like the original, like some of the early studies at Harvard that Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, I can't remember the name he went by before Ram Dass, but those were like working with like engineers and academics, giving them a therapeutic dosage of LSD at the time and asking them to focus on their problems. And there have been all these figures through history who've talked about like making major breakthroughs as a result of using some sort of psychedelic. And so that idea of like, what are the conditions required to have some sort of therapeutic experience feels like we are limited, even in the laws, right? That like it needs to be administered by a psychiatrist, I believe, in Oregon, right? Which is like a very like medical position that is oriented towards like the treatment of sick individuals as opposed towards like the creation of healthy individuals. And so a lot of those things feel like they're sort of philosophically opposed to what like historically, for thousands of years we would have used these substances for, which is a diatribe.
I just like, how could we not talk about that? Like the main reason is that it is just in the like the popular concept of psychedelics is related to a culture. Like to me, it evokes like the 60s and 70s tie-dye swirl, like that 70s show with Topher Grace and Ashton Kutcher and Mila Kunis, and like it's just like the whole concept of it in popular culture is around like the context, Meron, of like tripping out for pleasure purposes and not for the thing you're describing. So not to say that there isn't, and I don't know anything about this, like substantive scientific evidence of the potential in other uses. It's just like the reason that we're missing the point, we internet and beyond, to me is like, because that's just not what it is to most people. Not what it could be. It's just that isn't what it is today.
It's interesting in the context of Western, like when you were saying 60s, 70s, that feels very like American.
100%.
But then when Joey speaks to like shamans and things that go back
totally
in time,
different culture.
like, yeah, a different part of the world, or someone
Yes.
who comes from a different part of the world, we'll see it, differently.
Right. And that's, I guess, yeah. Sorry, I just wonder, like, is this then just like the predominant, like, United States culture, societal, like, concept of it that is the reason that it feels like we're missing this point? Like, is everyone else is everyone else like more progressive and like advanced on this concept than we are here?
I mean, I think a lot of the issues in the United States were a result of Nixon and Reagan's sort of anti-drug orientation.
Right.
Yeah, and in the 70s and 80s. And, when like you were talking about the tie-dye, which is certainly true, but it was like there was a lot of propaganda being put out by the government that has like documents have been unsealed, and it is like not like conspiracy theory land. Like it is there are like open conversations about sort of what they used to sort of have these like fear-inducing conversations about it. But when you looked at like the early studies, right, it was like people in like cardigans and like slacks, and they're like academics in like the hallowed halls of these like major institutions that we still hold in high esteem, having these experiences. And so that like I mean, I can tell you, I have had a bunch of psychedelic experiences, but the first time I did, I had all of that sort of cultural baggage going into it, where I was interested in wanting to explore it, and also quite trepidatious because I was fearful of this idea of like, what is a bad trip? And then I like all of these other things that surround it. But like historically, cultures around the world have had some sort of psychedelic, right? Like you had mescaline in like the American Southwest and like American Indian groups. You had like mushroom, right? That whole conversation about like the origin story of Santa coming from like these red and white mushroom caps, like polka dotted mushroom caps, and like the trip experience that comes from that in like what is it, like Swamiland? Is that what it was called in like Finland, northern areas and stuff? You have ayahuasca in the Amazon. You have all of these different natural psychedelics that people will experiment with to have these sort of spiritual breakthroughs. And now all of a sudden we're having these like this reawakening where people are studying it from like a language that we can understand today, right? Which is fundamentally science. Like, let's just say that, where they're like like what you would call like a heroic dose of mushrooms given in a therapeutic environment is dramatically more effective than antidepressants for breaking people out of sort of severe depressive episodes, because it is sort of just like a flash to the system and sort of like increasing neuroplasticity in the moment, where you're sort of like breaking these like wiring circuits where everything fires so strongly when you're in some of these psychedelic experiences that you're kind of like snapped out of these like patterns, or what my mom would say, like you're in a rut. And so those types of things, now that we're having conversations about those aspects of it, like the one thing, the last part of it, I guess I would ask you in some of the things that you said were like, can something be recreational and therapeutic at the same time? Like, are we capable of like holding those? I think we individually will have things that are both like recreational and therapeutic. But I think societally, like, I don't know whether we're sort of flexible enough in our ideas about things, right? Like, people take Xanax recreationally and therapeutically, but like we pretend like we're not taking Xanax like recretionally, and I think
are we?
Well, not you guys, but like there are people that do that.
Okay.
Just listen to rap today.
Yeah, Lil Xan.
These young kids. It's interesting because, the word that comes to mind is intention, right? Like, you could be taking it recreationally, and you could be taking it like, I'm partying, I'm trying to have a good time. And perhaps there could be a therapeutic benefit, but maybe with intention and in the right environment and in the right mental state, you could have more of a benefit because you're going in with the intention of like, healing. And it also made me think when you were talking earlier of like being guided through the experience could be a spiritual experience, or it could be, I guess, taking it into the medical context, like a healing experience, and it's facing something. But solo, it's seen as like reckless and an escape. But under guidance, it's the opposite of an escape. It's like leaning in deeper. And I think in The Mind Explained, the Netflix series, one of the parts
from Vox,
they talked about mindfulness and meditation. They talked about psychedelics, and some of these like treatments could last for like, one treatment can last you for like 3 months, or it can break. I think they were talking about the fear of cancer that a newly diagnosed cancer patient had. And it was like, once that fear was gone, right? Like the fear and worry and stress only, worsens things versus just like when that wasn't attached to it anymore because of the treatment, that person was more open to healing and was able to feed themselves, the thought, the energy, and probably the food and all the things that could help them heal.
Yeah, of coming to terms with and accepting a terminal illness is like one of the big early arenas that like started this progression of acceptance and beginning to explore psychedelics in a medical context, because it was very clear that people were able to have these breakthroughs where, like you said, is when you let go of the fear of dying, which is sort of, a lot of the terms that you wind up talking about that people sort of project when they come out of these experiences feel very spiritual. And I think that tends to make certainly Americans, but I think like people who are oriented towards a Western mindset kind of uncomfortable, right? Like when you're talking about medical treatments and you're also mixing in spiritual language, but this idea, like people come out talking about like ego death and accepting the fact that they're going to go, but that they are connected to their family and that things will carry on and that that they've had a good life or whatever it is, like the result is they feel on the back end considerably less fearful and comfortable and sort of like come to the end of their life with more of a sense of dignity and a lack of fear. And like whatever results in that sounds like a good thing, but those are not the exclusive arenas in which those treatments can work. And I think that like aspect of sort of breaking out of it, ultimately, these it's not just mushrooms or acid or any of these other things. I think it is like a historical bizarre set of policies and philosophies around drugs in general, right? Like there's a lot of treatments that they're learning about around like addiction and things like that with like MDMA, which is ecstasy or Molly or whatever people, whatever the kids want to call it. But like, I remember growing up, they're like, if you take ecstasy, it will burn holes in your brain. And like literally seeing posters in my college with like a picture of a brain with like holes in it. Right. And so like, there's been a lot of work put in to like freak people out around drugs and their relationship to it. And clearly it's not working if you look at the opioid crisis or the meth crisis or whatever. Like the way we've been thinking about things isn't working. And so that just brings us back to the internet and memes. And Jess, can you circle this up? What do you think? Can you do it?
One guy's acid trip really inspired you, Joey. And I'm actually kind of excited because instead of the route that most of the internet sounds like they took to make fun of this dude, you were like, but what about the first thing he mentioned? And I admit it's a tricky thing because I don't know anything about this, and I certainly carry my own personal and cultural baggage around drugs, and I think that clearly even Meron calling out that this is like certainly an American, especially cultural weight, feels right, but that there's like more room for growth when it comes to how we think about like curing mental ails, or even how people choose to get rid of mental blemishes they see in themselves, or how we choose to, balance what is fun with what is and feels good for us, if that's even possible. I don't even know. It's just, there's just like, the reason this seems to be a challenge is because it's confronting so many different things that we are culturally, emotionally, scientifically grappling with all at the same time. And maybe, Joey, you're just ahead of the curve. You're ahead of the internet where they can't even see it. And maybe, I don't know, maybe when you're like the old person on the internet and like watching all of the youths like changing their minds or coming to terms with psychedelics the way other cultures have, like you'll be like, wow, I started that. And that's what I hope for you.
In my day, they called them psychonauts.
Oh boy. Okay, what's an acid? Like which specific acid is the acid? Acid.
That's like a street name for
amino? No. That's just
it's LSD 25. Is like the chemical name of it, which is like
lysergic acid.
Lysergic acid.
Diethylamide.
Yeah.
I see. Well, cool. Thanks for bringing this to us.
Well, see you later. Critical Nonsense is a Sylvain production.
Sylvain! And recorded here.
We'd like to thank a special guest, Meron Medhanie, for just kicking it with us.
We'd also like to thank sound engineer, recreation, and therapy, Alex Cantel.
We'd like to thank designer Nora Mestrich for taking us on her spiritual journey and making everything a little bit better.
And the only ones who could be considered superior to Nap Pods, our production help, Sarah Gilbert, Les Jacobs, and Tony Blanc.
And as always, I think this week is Sorry, Ellen.
It is Sorry, Ellen. Joey was the one who brought the psychedelics thing. I just I'm putting him on blast right now. It wasn't me.
Special thanks to Ellen for deciding not to let me make that documentary in like 2012. I still have the treatment. I went back and read it recently and I was like, this is kind of good. I was surprised that like the treatment was actually good, but I would have had to give 4 people like a guided acid trip. I don't know where the legalities of that go. So he really had my back.
You would have sunk the company.
It makes it sound like I'm like a wild psychonaut on this. I'm
Yep,
not,
it does.
but have also had.
It sounds
I've
like
had
it.
therapeutic experiences.
Yep.
So also not trying to like hide from that and further stigmatize it. So,
You are
Ride
ride that
proof
line.
of recreational therapeutic trips,
Enlightenment.
experiences. It's
They
possible,
exist.
people.
It exists. Do y'all have some special thanks?
I have special thanks to pre-peeled garlic, since we didn't get a chance to talk about garlic fingers today.
Wow.
But the remedy to garlic fingers.
Do you pre-peeled but whole?
Yes. So that you could use, what do you call it?
The garlic press?
The press?
The press. I was like the smasher.
You don't have to
thing.
peel them for the press. That's
Okay.
that's the crazy part about the press. I was doing that and my wife was like, why are you peeling them? Just put it in the press. I was like, you can do that? And she's like, yeah, that's the whole point. And I was
My
like,
mom gets the pre-peeled garlic.Maybe she just tosses it into the food processor.
yeah, that does it. Yeah, you can't do that without peeling it.
Oh, that'd be messy.
Wow, that's smart. Pre-peeled garlic. And I feel like that still has a different, it's far closer to, with the peel. So peeled, but unpeeled?
Unpeeled whole clothes.
Unpeeled, so with
it's
the
not-
peel. Right, and like that's still way better than like the pre-minced in a jar in the fridge. That is like,
Yes. It's a
not the
little
same.
fresher. A little fresher.
I just like to think grapes. They're so delicious.
Which
I hadn't
kind?
had them in a long time, and I bought some for Emerson, and those shits are delicious. That's a great summer treat.
Refrigerated grapes.
Yeah, that is an important part of it. I mean, they're still good out of the fridge, great, but like refrigerated is like summertime. Holy shit.
production programmer Les Jacobs, also who we gave special thanks already, would be so furious if we didn't mention frozen grapes in this moment, of which he is a very substantial proponent. If you haven't tried it, you could try it out. And just, but if you're the, I will caveat, if you're the kind of person like me, admittedly, who like can't bite ice cream, then I actually would not go for the frozen grapes.
Sensitive teeth.
Just chew. Yeah, the teeth can't.
I'm literally squirming because it's making me physically uncomfortable thinking about like biting into a frozen grape. I'm like, ooh.
I feel the tooth.
You want to know a fun fact that I was thankful for? I found out that if you're anemic, there is a phenomena where you'll have the desire to chew on ice, and they don't quite know why.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't that weird?
I know
just
people
like
who
the
like
desire to
that.
chew on ice is such like a bizarre thing to be like, I don't have enough iron. I want to chew an ice cube. Like it doesn't resolve your anemia. It is just like this weird phenomena. So if you're chewing on ice, maybe eat some leafy greens or a steak.
Or raisins.
Are raisins high in iron?
Are raisins high in iron? That's like what every blood drive will tell you to do. If you're like, oh, sorry, we can't take your blood. Go eat like 5 pounds of raisins. Or actually, don't eat 5 pounds of raisins. I think that would be a problem. But eat like,
You may
more.
shit your pants.
What about oatmeal raisin cookies?
Yeah, I think that would count.
Okay.
Counts.
And it's got oats, so both sides of the health spectrum. Special thanks to oatmeal raisin cookies.
Soft.
We did it.
Yeah.
All right. I love you all. Goodbye.
Okay, thanks for joining us, Meta. Bye.
Recording.
Ah. We have to shake
Get
it
it
out.
out. Get it.
Get it out.
Is this for the bloopers?